Well, hello, Nativity Bible heads. It is Dr. Wayne, and I am bringing you your Sunday morning Power Bible Study. How's everybody doing today? We are in the fourth Sunday of Advent, and our first lesson today comes from the book of 2 Samuel. We've been in the prophet Isaiah for a while. By the way, in the way we categorize the books of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, when I say we, the Christian church has done something that the Jewish religion didn't do with them, which is to call the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, we call them history, which is like, no, it's not really history. They were put in a category called the prophets. Yeah, they were called the prophets, the former prophets. And then they're what we call the prophets come to be called the latter prophets. So the former prophets, why are they called the former prophets? Because narrative was for them an act of prophecy. And prophecy, we've got to get away from the idea that prophecy is looking into a crystal ball and let me tell you about your future. No, that's not what it's about. Prophecy is about forthtelling. It's forthtelling, calling forth a people into a way of being that could then be a match for who they are for God in the world. So this reading in 2 Samuel is in chapter 7. It's verses 1 through 11 and verse 16. I'll probably just go ahead and take on the whole chapter 7. But it is key in our Advent cycle of readings because our gospel reading today is the what we call the it's the Annunciation, I believe is what we call it, right? When Mary receives a visitation. No, is it the Annunciation or is it the Visitation? It's the Annunciation. She's going to conceive and bear a child, and he's going to be the Son of God, and that he's going to take the role of his father David as a king of the people. Well, you'll see that in the Luke story. But the whole background for any of that is in the Davidic narratives of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible. And specifically in 2 Samuel chapter 7, this is where we hear being spoken to David a word of promise about his dynasty, about his destiny. Remember, as prophecy, as we call the former prophets, the second Samuel, it's intended to call forth a way of being in the people. In the overall narrative, when you start with the book of Deuteronomy, I just kind of ruined my shot there, didn't I? When you start with the book of Deuteronomy and you go forward from Deuteronomy to Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, you have what we call the Deuteronomistic history, okay? The Deuteronomistic history is a continuous narrative of from the time of Moses to the end of the Davidic dynasty, to the exile. And in it, it's very, very plain that the covenant with the people is conditional on, are they gonna be faithful or are they not? And ultimately they are not. And so the Deuteronomistic overall thrust is, hey, this thing's conditional. There's no guarantees here. There's no guarantee you're going to fail. There's no guarantee you're going to succeed. But bottom line, this promised land that God's I'm speaking as God, that I'm giving y'all. You know what? Can you mess it up and lose it? Yeah, you can. So just want you to be sure that you know what's going on here. But when the page is turned and the time of the judges is over and the people demand a king, and Samuel tells the people, no, you don't want a king. What do you want a king for? Kings are horrible. Kings are gonna draft your sons and steal your daughters and tax your wealth. And people keep saying, oh no, we want a king, want a king. And God's all like, no, I'm supposed to be their king. Well, what happens? A relenting happens. Kingship happens. Saul is the first king, and Saul doesn't work out so well. And it turns out that when the Davidic line starts, that God intervenes at a point of saying, okay, this earthly king thing, I get it. That's the way that this is going to be. Well, okay, if you're going to have a king, it's going to be a king my way. And with the line of David, God takes a hold of the Davidic line. God takes a hold of kingship like king had never been grasped by any god ever. Because it used to be that if you were king, what this means is that you were deity already. Israel introduced the idea that king is not deity, but king is most representative of and almost like a priestly presence for that their God. And that's the reason why the kings came to be metaphorically referred to as shepherds, because that's the way God led his people. It was as a shepherd. And so when the kings started to do what the king started to do, God related to them like a son. And as a son, what does that mean? Well, how is a father and son related to each other? Father and son are related to each other in a way where father teaches son, father chastises son, father makes sure that son is on the right path. And occasionally, son goes the wrong way, and then son has goes so far off the beaten path that that there's you got prodigal son going on, right? Okay, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I want you to give you a big picture of the way it is that sonship and the king of Israel was viewed in that time. So in 2 Samuel chapter 7, we find David as being king. And David is at the beginning of his making Jerusalem the religious center of the nation, okay? Prior to David, there was a temple in Shiloh. I mean, we already, at the beginning of Samuel, when Hannah goes to Eli, where does she see him at? At the temple in Shiloh. So it's not like there wasn't a temple before. It's not like they didn't worship the Lord before. But the temple, David decides, Jerusalem is the place where all of this should be from heretofore. And he is in that process of consolidating his power and making Jerusalem not just the civic center of the nation, but also the religious center, okay? So in chapter 7, verse 1 of 2 Samuel, we read Now, when the king was settled in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, the king said to the prophet Nathan. Now, okay, first of all, this idea, the king was settled in his house. The word house is going to be a key word here, because it's going to be a key word that it pivots the whole conversation, okay? And when it says the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, hardly, if you just skip over to chapter 8, 9, 10, 11, you're going to see that there were a whole bunch more wars. And in 1 Kings, there's more there. So David, even though it says he had been given rest from all his enemies, it wasn't a permanent rest, okay? So verse 2, the king said to the prophet Nathan. Now, Nathan was somebody that we've seen before. He is that one who has been with David, been willing to speak truth to David. There's all kinds of, I don't have time to go into all of that, but David cherishes Nathan's words. Nathan sometimes speaks truth to power, and sometimes Nathan is a little bit, shall we say, suck-uppy, okay? A little bit. We might see that in this passage, right? So, see now, verse 2, the second half of verse 2. See now, I am living in a house of cedar, but the ark of God stays in a tent. What are we talking about here? The Ark of the Covenant, ever since the wilderness wanderings, was always housed in a tent. That was the way it was instructed to Moses to keep the Ark of the Covenant. A tent was a mobile, it represented mobility, it represented not being fastened to a certain place, the idea that God couldn't be pegged in, couldn't be penned down, but was mobile, was always on the move, right? Well, the people were no longer on the move. The people had taken possession of the land of promise. And so David is, the king said to the prophet Nathan, so this is David talking to Nathan, I'm living in this house of cedar, but the ark of God is in a tent. So what happens when you are in a position of power and you're a little bit like, okay, things are going pretty good for me. I've got peace from my enemies. I got a little money in the bank. I feel a little grateful to God. David's motivation here, I don't think it was 100% pure, okay? I believe that it comes a little bit out of hubris, a little bit out of wanting to do something that would increase his stature not only amongst the people, but also amongst the reaches beyond Israel. Nathan said to the king, verse 3, go, do all that you have in mind, for the Lord is with you. Okay, Nathan, go with it. But that same night, look at this. The word of the Lord came to Nathan, verse 5. Go and tell my servant David. Now remember, this is all coming to Nathan the prophet, not directly to David, okay? Thus says the Lord, are you the one to build me a house to live in? I think this is great. This is, I use some, it's a little bit comedic, a little bit, I don't know if it's not really irony, sarcasm, okay, I think that's what we get. Really? Are you the one to build me a house to live in? I believe that the Lord is responding to David at the level, I know he's not talking directly to David, but the word is for David, but he's talking to Nathan, a little bit too like, okay, I think your hubris is getting to you a little bit here. Really? You're going to build me a house? Verse 6, I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day. But I have been moving about in a tent and a tabernacle. So David had this idea. Oh, I'm living in this wonderful house. Oh, but the ark of God is in a tent. It's not a pure motivation, I believe. I have not lived in a house since the day I was brought up to this day, but I have been moving about in a tent and a tabernacle. And that's perfectly fine. The thing that God is saying is that there's nothing wrong with the fact that my Ark of the Covenant is in a tent. Nothing wrong with it whatsoever. Verse 7, wherever I have moved about among all the people of Israel, did I ever speak a word with any of the tribal leaders of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? So it's like God is saying, I've never had a house. That's the way it was supposed to be. And I never complained once. I haven't asked this. I haven't asked anything. This is not something that I am requesting or requiring. Verse 8, now therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep. Notice that thing about following sheep. Yes, David was a shepherd. We knew that from the story. But notice how it plays on that thing of back from verse 7, where the Lord was speaking, saying, did I ever speak a word with any of the tribal leaders of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel? So the tribal leaders were the shepherds of Israel, okay? That refers to the times of the judges. God is not so keen on the idea of kingship, okay? But God is going with it because that's the way we are, okay? So this is what we have to see now in verse 8. Look at this. Now therefore, thus says verse 8, now therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from the following sheep, to be prince over my people Israel, to be prince. Prince is a nice word. Notice it's not the word king, it is the word prince. It's interesting that he doesn't use the word king. But the idea is, prince is more of a way of like saying like my designated leader, okay? And I have been with you, verse 9, and I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off all your enemies from before you. Yeah, okay, all of them, a lot of them, yeah. The idea here is that any victory and any solace they have received from their enemies was not on their own doing. It was all God. That's the point here, okay? All right. And I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off all your enemies and I will make for you. Oh, and I will make, where I'm in the last stanza of verse 9, and I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth. So just out of the blue, God is saying, you know what? Your comfort and your experienced prosperity, you know what? It's all from me. And you know what? I am not going to spite my nose to spite my face, to cut off my nose to cut off my nose to spite my face. He's basically saying, you know what? I'm doing this. I'm making your name great. And verse 10, and I will appoint a place for my people Israel and will plant them. This is the idea of a temple of worship. Saying will, so that they may live in their own place and be disturbed no more. So it's like the idea is, yes, the idea of temple is going to happen. Yes, the people will experience a sense of peace that comes from me and not from anything else. And evildoers shall afflict them no more as formerly. This was an ideal that they had, that there would be this pax whatever of like, oh, we'll never have to worry about our enemies again. Now, did they ever not have to worry about their enemy? No. There was always some force going on outside of them that was a threat. This was always happening. It was never not happening. But the idea is that God is giving them a promise that if there is the experience of that, guess what? It's coming from me. It's not coming from anything that you've done, okay? Okay. Moreover, I mean the last verse, sentence of verse 11. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. Yeah, how do you like that? Oh, you think you're going to make me a house? I'm going to make you a house. And when I say you, I don't mean I'm going to build you a house. I'm literally going to make you and your lineage a house, a dynasty, okay? Something that David didn't ask for, something that you wouldn't think like, oh, why would God do this? God just does things like this because God is God, okay? God is, there's nothing that we do that deserves any of the good things that God gives us. This is an example of one such thing. We call it grace. Verse 12. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors. Now I'm getting into some verses here that weren't actually in the reading. 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 12 to 15. But I'm going to read them, 12 to 15. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name. He shall build a house for my name. This is referring to Solomon, David's offspring through Bathsheba. Not the first son from Bathsheba, from that gnarly incident that we know about, but the second son of Bathsheba. Verse 13, he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. This is the nature of kingship. Kingship and sonship are the same thing in the eyes of God. That's why he says to David, I made you a prince over my people. Why? Prince, because God is the Father, okay? And I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will father him, and he shall be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will punish him with a rod such as mortals use, with blows inflicted by human beings. What is this referring to? It's referring to the fact that it's going to be a stormy relationship between God and the kings, and it proves very much to be exactly that. The kings don't necessarily stay true, and they will eventually get exiled because of the fact that, well, the kings just didn't do what the kings were supposed to do. Verse 15, but I will not take my steadfast love from him. That word steadfast love is that Hebrew word chesed that I've mentioned many times in my Bible studies. Chesed means solidarity. God's solidarity. God's solidarity with us. The idea that God is with us, like a rock is a rock, okay, and then a rock just doesn't crumble, okay. Solidarity, just solid with us, not because we deserve it, not because we think that we've done things that please God. No, simply because God is God, and God chooses us because God chooses us. Okay. But I will not take my steadfast love from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. So the promise here is that it actually refers to that time, that previous kingship of Saul that didn't go so well, and Saul's line didn't continue. David was chosen as a new king, and God's introduced a new relationship with David, and this is what that is referring to, that this lineage is going to continue through David, but it didn't with Saul, obviously, right? And verse 16, which is the last verse in our reading for this morning, your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. The words for forever are very problematic in the Hebrew language, because we have an idea of forever, forever, adolam, eternity. We're not 100% sure they had a concept of eternity back then, but the idea here that the church picked up on is that this forever, it certainly hasn't ended yet, thinking the early church, seeing Jesus and Jesus being of the house of David through Joseph as his earthly father, not physical father. The early church saw in these promises to David a fulfillment in the person Jesus. In fact, Luke is very keen on this. If Luke hadn't read and been totally drenched in the Davidic theology of the books of Samuel and Kings, you know what? We might not have seen the stories that we do in the beginning of Luke with Mary and Elizabeth and the Annunciation and the birth in Bethlehem and all of that. We might not. Mark certainly didn't need it. John certainly didn't need it. So Luke, the gospel writer Luke, was so, I believe, entrenched in the theology of this Davidic promise theology, that he had to find a way to articulate it. And that's what we have in the first couple of chapters of Luke, is our beloved nativity stories, right? Which further steep Jesus in the being the fulfillment of this. The people weren't so sure that they were going to ever see something like this again. This messianic promise, this messianic ideal, the idea that this anointed of the line of David, Jesus himself wasn't so keen on it, okay? Not nearly as keen on it as the gospel writers were. Jesus seems to, at times, if you will, poo-poo the idea of, oh yeah, the Davidic thing, well, Jesus stepped into being the Son, okay? The Son of God, And he didn't have to play the David card. The gospel writers knew, though, that there was a segment of the believing populace that needed to have that box checked. And without checking that box, there could be no acceptance of Jesus as Messiah. And so that's one of the things that Luke does. Matthew participates in it as well. Not necessary for John, not necessary for Mark, but it is key in our understanding of the way the gospel writers knew what their readership, what their people that they were, the audience that they were trying to reach. They knew what they needed to say in order to make sure that there was a comforting message there, which is what you have to do when you're crafting a narrative. So this passage, I'm not going to do any more of chapter 7. That's it. That's all we're going to cover for today. But I just wanted to emphasize that this chapter in 2 Samuel, it gets elevated to a level of understanding that makes it that people could just never let go of, and they always held on to it like, oh, there's gonna be a Davidic heir, there's gonna be a Davidic heir, there's gonna be a Davidic heir. Well, you know what? Jesus, yeah, line of David, yeah, sure, but no, was he the kind of David/Messiah that they wanted? No. He wasn't a political leader. He wasn't a military leader. He didn't usher in, the new nation of Israel. He didn't overthrow the Romans. So there was nothing there for him to fulfill. Jesus was very clear that his way of messiahship was going to be in a mode that was different than the expectation. This is why they killed him. And this is why we then have the whole gospel and the whole transformation of violence against God's Son as redemption for humanity. It's a grand irony, if you will. But this chapter in 2 Samuel is key in creating that expectation that creates the possibility of those stories and those scriptures that we have then in Luke. And so therefore, that is why we are learning about the Davidic promise here on the 4th week of Advent. So there you have it. I don't know what passage Martha is preaching on today, or preached. See, I'm doing this at 9 a.m. Remember, I'm doing this at 9 a.m. So if you want to see it before church, you can tune in. And so, like I said, I don't know if she's going to talk about the Annunciation, or maybe she's going to preach on. I don't know. Anyway, so there you have it. That's your context for your lectionary passage from the first lesson today. Blessings on your 4th week of Advent.